Hey there, art nerds! Happy Mother's Day! To celebrate, I thought we would do something thematically fitting. So here we have a mother and her daughter making jam together. I'm going to walk you guys through this watercolor tutorial as step by step as possible, but keep in mind it has been time-lapsed significantly from over 6 hours of watercolor painting to just over 30 minutes. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything as in-depth as you might like, but I will link other relevant watercolor tutorials to inspire you guys. This illustration is in my coloring book, Curious Little Things, and if you've purchased Curious Little Things, there is a download link where you can download the high resolution scan for this illustration and print it out onto watercolor paper if you'd like to color along with me. I'll have a link for that down in the description below, as well as a list of the materials that I use to paint this watercolor illustration if you're looking for some art supplies to request as your Mother's Day present. I hope you guys enjoy painting with me as much as I enjoyed painting this illustration and sharing it with you guys. So grab your paints, grab your brushes, grab your paper, and let's paint making jam together for Mother's Day. I'm painting today on Stonehenge Aqua watercolor paper. I inked my illustration with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen, and now I am stretching it on plastic gator board using a hake brush, some clean water, a spray bottle of water, and some bulldog and binder clips. I'm also using 3M blue painter's tape to help hold it still and sturdy while we're painting it. If you're looking for a step-by-step stretching tutorial, I have some of those on this channel as well, and I'll link those for you guys down in the description below, but hopefully this gives you guys the gist of it. So for this illustration, I am painting with my big Mega Daler Driver palette, and I wanted to create a warm wash to kind of create an underpainting and to give some atmosphere. So I am trying out Winsor & Newton's Rose d'Or color, and this is a beautiful pinky red color, to kind of apply some pinks to the background. I used a clean paper towel to dab it out of their faces so that their faces don't get too dark. That's going to create a bit of a bright spot in the illustration, and it's going to help draw the eye and create some contrast. And I'm just kind of lifting it up and also relayering it as we go, just kind of in a way that I feel works for this illustration. I let that dry fully, and then I spritz everything down. I'm going to move everything over so you guys can see what I'm working with just a little bit better. And first, I'm going to create some rays of light, and I'm using a slightly opaque yellow from Holbein. It might be a Naples yellow, along with a warmer yellow, and I'm using a large quill to apply this. And then at the bottom of the illustration, I'm using ultramarine blue, and I'm starting to kind of just dab it in really loose and wet into wet to start creating some shading. So we've got the top of the illustration where there's a lot of sunlight coming in, and then we have the bottom of the illustration that gets darker with this nice granulating blue that's going to not only add some warmth because it is a warmer blue, but it's also going to add some beautiful granulation that's going to just kind of make this really atmospheric. So we're painting on a cotton rag paper today because we are dealing with a lot of water, and I want the ability to do these really loose washes and to do a lot of layers and to do some really nice wet into wet. So as things start to dry, I'm going to start doing an underpainting, a grise, using our ultramarine blue to start blocking in some of the shadows and kind of establishing our values and our light source early on. So the way I'm thinking about it is our light source is coming from the upper right hand corner, just kind of mythical lighting here. So basically, like we're painting in the recessed shelf unit, I'm going to paint most of that in pretty dark, so like it's recessed to create this illusion of depth. And then I'm kind of working from like the main light source is coming from the upper right, but not necessarily behind our characters, more like directly from the side. I've also mixed up a wash of some rose d'or with probably a little bit of burnt sienna and maybe some burnt umber in there to paint the actual background itself. Some of these are like the burnt umber, for example, is a really beautiful granulating color. I apologize, my camera is just going crazy here. It can't decide where to focus, but I promise that's not going to be an issue for the majority of the tutorial. Go back in and really reestablish that sunlight and really kind of get that warm, cozy, homey feeling going on. And then I'm blocking in even more of our rose d'or wash to really warm up the bottom so that we have these layers of our ultramarine blue and our rose d'or. As that dries, I'm going to add in some more browns to it. So some more burnt sienna and maybe some more burnt umber, and really block that in towards the bottom where it's still wet. I'm working fairly quickly with this with a larger quill. I think it is the Paul Rubens quill. If you're looking for a good quill, Diane W. and Paul Rubens both make some good, very affordable quills. And I'm also adding some more pink in the background. So right now I'm still really thinking about color and atmosphere and creating an atmosphere that just feels really warm and inviting and friendly and cozy, because that's what I want the viewer to get from this illustration. I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to the tops of their eyes as well as on their teeth to create some shadow on the white. And then I am mixing up another batch of color. I'm adding some more brown to my initial wash so that I can start painting in the background. So the walls of this environment, I want them to have kind of a warm, brownish, sort of earthy feel. And I mixed in some burnt umber to our existing mix with burnt sienna, rose d'or, and originally burnt umber. I'm also adding in probably a little bit of Van Dyke brown, which is a warmer brown, but not a whole lot of it because I really don't want to get really dark with this. But we're going to have our areas that are further away from the light source, like where I'm working on right now, which are going to be darker than the areas that are going to be lighter and closer to the light source. I'm also blocking in the shelves, and I'm working on filling in the areas behind the two characters. Now, usually when I'm doing watercolor, I try to think about like doing the environment first or painting the larger areas first, the areas that are going to take a lot of washes, that are going to take a lot of patience, because those are areas that have a tendency to reactivate the surrounding areas. Like for example, if I painted her hair, it might bleed into it because we're adding so much water. Speaking of, I'm using ultramarine blue to do some underpainting on the herbs in the background, as well as to start the grise on the cutting board in the foreground. I'm also adding some phthalo blue to the herbs to make them seem, well, no, actually, I think that's ultramarine blue now that I look at it. And it's just a much thicker wash of the ultramarine blue to really start knocking in those shadows. At this stage, I'm just kind of going back and forth between doing the underpainting in ultramarine blue to establish our shadows and painting the background. I'm just kind of gauging the contrast and seeing how I feel about the shadows. I don't want to go so dark with the shadows that it kind of deadens everything. Ultramarine blue, particularly this Sennelier French ultramarine blue, it can have a tendency when mixed too thickly to start going opaque and to start going really flat. So you want to kind of ride that balancing line where you haven't layered it up so much that it starts to feel muddy and dead, but you're still getting some of that beautiful granulation and you're still getting some of the beautiful warmth from that ultramarine blue. So once I've got that fairly established, I'm going to start moving on to the herbs. And I'm starting with a really bright and light yellow green, painting the outside of it. And then I'm grabbing a darker, probably a chromium green, to start painting the interior. I want the lighter green on the outside so that it looks like the light is hitting it, and I'm allowing it to blend wet into wet. I used a little bit of olive green for the stems, and then I added in some red just to kind of make it appear more brown. A quick spritz with water to encourage some of the colors to move around a little bit because it was starting to look a little bit too stiff. And then I'm moving on to adding some more. I think I mixed some burnt umber in with our ultramarine blue to create a Payne's gray, and I'm using that on the jars all the way at the bottom in the foreground just to kind of create that appearance of glass. So I'm going to start working on filling in and painting all of the spices and all of the cooking ingredients in the foreground. So we have rice and we have salt and we have a jar of paprika and we have a jar of turmeric. So I'm starting to work on our closer to the viewer environmental assets. And I'm using a little bit of Winsor & Newton's Payne's Gray to paint the lids on our jars, since that makes a really beautiful sort of metallic color. For this illustration, I had a better idea of the sort of feeling I wanted the viewer to get than really the color palette that I had in mind, but I knew I wanted to go mostly with light and bright as well as with really warm colors to really help push this sort of nostalgic, warm and cozy sort of moment where knowledge is being passed on to the next generation. That sort of really fuzzy sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm going as I'm picking the colors. The only thing in the very beginning that I knew the color of from the get-go were the blueberries as well as the rosemary in the background. So I'm trying to kind of play a balancing act of the colors, and I also wanted to represent real herbs and spices rather than just whatever would work. So for blueberries, if you guys aren't familiar with them, they are this really bright green when you first cut them, sometimes with a little bit of hints of red in there. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that. And now I'm moving on to the skin tones. And I think for this one, I went with my usual mix of a little bit of Scarlet Lake with some yellow ochre, really watered down, and that way you can kind of build it up. And that's going to give you a very light skin tone, but you can achieve the same sort of thing by using burnt sienna. And that's going to give you a really beautiful sort of translucent skin tone that can be built up into darker skin tones very easily without the color necessarily getting kind of grainy and muddy on you. Sometimes mixing skin tones can be challenging, but burnt sienna is a really good color for both light skin tones and much darker skin tones. Now that first layer of skin tone has dried, I've mixed it much more saturated so you guys can actually see it actually start to appear on my overexposed recording. And you guys have also noticed that I have switched to a smaller round. So I like painting with natural hair brushes for the most part because it gives me the kind of water control I need, and it's also soft enough that I can do the kind of glazes that I often want to be able to do. I find that synthetics, at least pure synthetics, tend to scrape up my pigments from my paper. So I'm working with silver black velvet brushes today, and they are a mix of synthetic and natural hair fibers. They're a little on the soft side, but they're really easy to paint with, and they hold up longer than a lot of my full natural hair brushes have. So they're what I would recommend if you're fairly serious about watercolor and you want something good but not overly expensive. So for this illustration, I'm using the Rose Dior as the blush color on their skin tones. Now, sometimes I'll use Scarlet Lake and sometimes I'll use Alizarin Crimson on these lighter sort of skin tones, but the Rose Dior is such a beautiful color for this. And you guys let me know in the comments how to pronounce it. I took a million years. I started taking French classes in 4th grade and took them all the way through my college graduation, and I'm still atrocious at speaking it. It is D-O-R-E. Would that be pronounced Doré? I'm not super sure, and then since it's being released by Winsor & Newton, I'm not sure if we're going to go with like the anglicized pronunciation for that. So those of you who are a little bit more couth than I am, let me know in the comments. So now that we've started really blocking in the skin tone, I can start blocking in the rest of the illustration. So for the blueberries, I wanted to capture that kind of rich purplish color that you get by layering a naphthalide maroon with an indigo on top of it to get that kind of richer purple than you would get if you just went in with straight dioxazine violet or dioxazine purple. I'm also starting to block in some of the herbs and some of the preserved fruits and veggies in the background as well, mostly going with local color at this point in time because I spent a lot of time doing the underpainting and starting to establish the shadows. Since the skin tone has had a chance to dry, I can build it up with another layer on top of it, keeping in mind that the light source is still coming from the upper right hand side, and also keeping in mind that I don't want to go too dark. I really want to keep everything very light and cozy and friendly for this illustration. I haven't entirely decided what colors to make what colors to use for their outfits. So instead, I'm kind of focusing on the things that I know what colors they're going to be, because these are real world objects. So I can easily just reference different things and paint what I'm seeing, whether it's the peppercorns all the way at the top or some of the preserved green things. And I'm sorry, I forgot what they were, and I'm editing on a tiny phone screen, so I can't quite see, or the preserved blueberries behind them. I have an idea of what those things should be. So while I'm still kind of thinking about what colors I want to use for their outfits, I'm working on blocking in the background. And you guys might have noticed that I also haven't started painting the cutting board or the counter yet either. So for the skin tone, I wanted to go ahead and introduce some of the shading on the skin, and I'm using a really warm sort of mauvish mix. It's like a red violet for this. And in some areas, I'm leaving the shadows harsher. Those would be like cast shadows that are directly blocking light. And in some areas, I'm kind of blending out the shadows. That would just be the shadows that are caused as the form moves away from the light source in space. At this point, I've blocked in enough that I've decided to keep the cutting board kind of a lighter wood, like a balsa wood sort of color. And I've also decided on what color to make the counter and the shelf. I was initially kind of leaning towards making them really, really dark, like a really dark wood, but I'm going to build up to that and we're going to see how it goes. So I have mixed some burnt umber with some Van Dyke brown, and we've started painting the shelves in the back. So I am working on Stonehenge Aqua, not necessarily because it is the best cotton rag paper, although I think it has a lot of selling points to it, but because it is an affordable cotton rag paper, and it is one that I've been using for pretty much all of the Lilliputian Living illustrations, including this one. And it is also a paper that can take a lot of water and a lot of layers. But one of the things you need to keep in mind about Stonehenge Aqua is you do need to give it time to dry out. If your painting is starting to lift too easily, if the colors are all bleeding into each other too much, if everything is just kind of behaving strangely, it's a good time to step away for an hour and let the paper start to dry out. That'll make the fibers close up, and that will kind of lock in your pigment, so they're not going to be as prone to moving around, reactivating, spreading all over the place. So I did mention this painting took over 6 hours to paint. I did not mention that it took about a week to paint. So there's a lot of dry time. You guys saw me put a lot of water on this paper. There's a lot of dry time that just, due to the nature of YouTube and time-lapse, I can't really show you guys, but I wanted to mention it because I think a lot of people who are struggling with watercolor are just not giving it time to dry. They're not giving themselves enough time to work on something. And I feel a little bit guilty because it is a time-lapse video. That is the majority of what I do. And I want to make sure that I'm good about disclosing just how much time art can take to make. So we have blocked in the shelves in the background with some darker browns. We've started to block in the counter as well. So while that's drying, I'm going to start adding some delineation and some detail on our rosemary. And what I mean by this is we are, for the most part, filling it in with a darker green, but I am trying to leave some of the individual little rosemary leaves still light. And then while that's still wet, because Stonehenge Aqua holds onto that water and stays wet and open for longer periods, I'm dabbing in some darker green so we get this nice diffused wet into wet sort of shading on our rosemary in the background. So I've been kind of working my way around the paper, filling things in here and there, but I haven't really been working on the characters too much because I am still deciding what I want to do with the outfits, but it's given me a chance to kind of refine everything else while I'm still thinking about it. It also gives the characters a chance to kind of dry out and for me to see, how the shading is turning out and if that's working for me. Do I want to do another layer of that sort of thing? So if you guys are interested in learning how to render different materials, whether it is metal, glass, or wood, I have a much older series that I did a few years ago where I demonstrate techniques for painting those kind of objects, and those are based on some studies that I'd done at the time. I'm probably much better at it now than I was then, partially because I rely really heavily on Google Images. I love to look everything up and see how things are supposed to look, and then even though I have a cartoonier art style, I'm always working from photo reference, and I encourage you to do the same thing too, because I don't know about you guys, but I do not have a photo memory. I might think I know how something looks, but I really don't. So I recommend kind of painting what you see when it comes to objects that exist in the real world or have a really close real world analog. Like obviously I do this kind of whimsical fantasy stuff all the time, but I do like to work from reference. So I am adding a little bit more of our rose d'or to the lips and to the cheeks, as well as to the cut blueberries. And after I added that, I realized I wanted to do a lot more work with the skin. So I'm doing another layer of regular skin tone. It's had a chance to really evaporate and saturate and get a lot darker, so we can do some better like building up of the forms and actually adding some color to it. I'm also going to add some more of our rose d'or to the cheeks and to other areas of blushing, and that's going to make everything just seem a lot more lively and alive. Now, I do want to point out that because I haven't yet painted their hair or their clothing, it can be really hard to gauge if the skin is saturated enough, if it's built up enough, because right now it looks really kind of bright and kind of garish, but that's because we're comparing it to everything surrounding it immediately, which is basically almost the same white as the paper. We did do those toning washes, but comparatively, it's still really unfinished. So I've decided that I wanted to do a little bit of underpainting. So I'm using ultramarine blue because I decided I wanted to do a blonde tone for their hair color, and blondes can be kind of difficult to shade. Sometimes it's actually easier to do it as an underpainting first and just kind of glaze your yellows and your ochres and your, really light burnt sienna on top of that, rather than trying to glaze the darker sort of ultramarine blue that you might want to influence their hair color on top of it. So I'm using the same Naples yellow that I did at the very beginning, that we kind of added in those sunbeams early on, as the sort of top layer of the hair. And I'm also using more of the ultramarine blue on the lace of the shirt. Since the lace would be white, we're going to use the ultramarine blue really watered down as kind of a shadow color on the shirt. Adding in a little bit more of the skin tone. And you guys can also see I used the blue painter's tape that I'm using to stretch my illustration as kind of a side palette for, just small amounts of color that really I'm just mixing it on my brush, and I want to make sure that it gets really well integrated. I switched out my palette, moving it further to the back, and I have a fresh one. So ceramic palettes can get kind of expensive, usually $13, $14 a pop, depending on where you get them from. But you can get ceramic plates from Dollar Tree, Goodwill, Walmart, the Asian market, like that little divided plate I have there is a sauce container from the Asian market, and those can make great palettes if you don't need all the individualized wells. I actually have a video where I talk about my favorite studio supplies, as well as a video where I talk about getting studio supplies on a budget if you are starting out or if you're looking for some new kind of fun things for your studio. I hope you guys will check them out. I'll try to remember to link them for you guys. So I wanted to do a surface pattern in ultramarine blue on her shirt. I'm going for a check pattern here. So I painted the base color of blue. Now I'm painting the stripes, going in one direction across her shirt, and try to keep in mind that the shirt isn't this flat object, it's covering a person's form. So try to keep in mind the curves of the body when you're doing that. And that's definitely just one of those things that it's going to take some practice to get used to. It's going to take some figure drawing to get used to. So don't get discouraged if it's something that you find that you're kind of struggling with. I'm also going with a pink for the little girl shirt, and I wanted the eye color to be different since they have the same hair color. So I went with a really bright green for her and a blue for the little girl. Now, once that first layer of stripes fully dried, I can glaze my second layer of stripes on, and that's what's going to give us that beautiful sort of layered plaid or checkered pattern, is allowing your stripes to dry before you do the next set of stripes. Now, if you want the colors to mix or blend into each other, then just do them like back to back. Don't even give them a chance to dry. So now that I've painted in both of their tops, I have a good idea of where I want to take the rest of the colors for this illustration. So I'm going to give her a khaki colored apron, and I'm doing that by going in with some yellow ochre, just really light to start up with, because you can always mix it more saturated, but it's a lot harder to take that away. It can be done, just harder to do. I'm also adding in our wood grain pattern to the cutting board using a darker brown. And remember, I have tutorials where I talk about this kind of pattern making in depth, so hopefully you guys will check those out. I'll link them in the description for you guys. Grabbing some more of our yellow, and I'm starting to render in her hair, trying to make sure that I use the brush. And what I mean by that is we're not just filling the whole thing in. We're using brush strokes, and we're leaving areas that are lighter to imply a highlight. Once that layer had a chance to dry, I'm going in with a darker mix of our yellow with a little bit of Indian yellow mixed in, so we get some of that nice warm gold, or maybe I'm using a little bit of Queen Gold in there. Anyway, I'm going with a warmer translucent yellow to start building up the hair color itself and to kind of show the hair color in shadow. And we're really trying to keep with like warm and light colors for this. We're trying not to get too dark, although we can use some darker areas for storytelling and to create depth in the illustration. So the way we've kind of rendered this with the foreground things, so the jars in the foreground, those are more in shadow, and that kind of implies that we are behind the jars and that we're not lit necessarily by the same light source. So we're using some of that shadow for storytelling purposes as well. Speaking of shadow, I wanted to add some more shadow to her apron, so I went in with some more of our ultramarine blue, and then I'm doing a cute little surface pattern of leaves on the top of the apron because it was starting to feel kind of overly utilitarian. And this is something that I'm going to bring into her hair ribbon later on as well. I'm also going to add a little pattern of roses to her apron using the Rose Dior. Maybe I got inspired by that, but it also adds a little bit of those warmer colors that we've been kind of working into the background of the illustration, kind of brings those into the foreground and makes them a little bit more noticeable. So for the type of watercolor illustration that I currently do, I primarily work with quills and rounds. I find them to just be really flexible and really good for this kind of illustration work. If you're looking for something a little bit more expressive, or if you're looking for chunkier line arts, using something like a flat might be a good way to kind of add some visual interest into your work with a different type of brush stroke. Because while quills and rounds are just good all-rounders. They can have kind of, I won't say a limited number of strokes, but it starts to become kind of predictable, and having a chunkier, different shape to your stroke can add some visual interest and can make things just feel a little bit fresher. It can add a different challenge to your art, and maybe that's something I should try playing around with in my next watercolor illustration. So if you're working on an illustration like this and you're not sure what you want to do about the color palette, you don't have to do what I did and, play, let's see how it goes, and possibly roll the dice and end up with a color palette you don't like. There are online tools that you can use to generate color palettes. You can also mock it up using, you can do a sketch of it with crayons or color pencils, or even in watercolor. You can also do a sketch of it digitally just to kind of get an idea for what you want the colors to be. I kind of like playing it by ear and being responsive with the colors, though. While I have created some real failures before, I've also experimented with techniques, experimented with color combinations, experimented with glazing, and I've been able to discover some things that I really enjoyed. So for me, not having everything entirely figured out leaves some spontaneity to it that just really appeals to my ADHD brain. So at this point, everything is pretty much blocked in. We've got all the colors on the paper, and now it's really just about refining details and going in, adding in small accents, adding in some shadows here and there, adding in a darker variation of the color. So you guys see I work with a fairly large color palette here. I've actually added more half pans since I have painted this illustration. Most of these are colors that you could mix with a good 12 color mixing set. You don't have to have a huge palette like this. They are convenience colors, so they're pre-mixed for my convenience, but this facilitates me doing a lot of watercolor painting. It also means I'm not mixing so much color trying to get just the right color, and it facilitates me painting comic pages. So this is something that I've amassed over several years, and a giant addiction to watercolor painting, but it's not something that's absolutely necessary for you to be able to paint, or even for you to paint this illustration. You guys just saw me remove the bulldog and binder clips. I usually have them on when I'm doing the really large wet washes, just to hold the paper tight and to make sure it dries tight. But once I've kind of moved on to filling in smaller areas or working with less water and I want to get in there and do details, I go ahead and remove them. At this point, I have pulled out my watercolor pencils. These are so, I love these things. Maybe I lean too heavily on them. They are great for adding highlights, for lightening areas, for darkening areas, for adding shadow, for slightly adjusting things, for adding rim lighting. So you guys always see me pull out the watercolor pencils when I'm doing watercolor illustrations, because it allows me to put those finishing touches and to just really kind of finesse it in a way that at this stage, I couldn't necessarily do it in watercolor alone. So I have some brands that I really like. I'll link them for you guys in the comments. I've reviewed a bunch of different watercolor pencils a few years ago and shared my favorites. So if you guys have any brands that you would recommend that maybe I haven't tried, I would love to hear about them. Let me know in the comments. So we know we are almost done with the watercolor illustration when you guys see me pull out the white gouache. And I use this just to add some white highlights and some white accents here and there, whether it's the shinies in the eyes or to add a little bit of kind of a reflection to the glass. You guys also saw me pull back out a yellow watercolor pencil just to add some more rays of sun going across the rosemary in the background. It was a little bit too dark. It was pulling a little bit too much of the attention. There was too much contrast going on there. So just doing some sun rays across it lightens it up a little bit. And it also helps with the storytelling because it kind of pushes the narrative of like sunlight coming in from a window that we can't quite see. I want to reinforce that with a little bit of our Naples yellow. So this is a more opaque yellow watercolor that's made by Holbein. It is super pretty. It's such a fun color to work with. I love love using it for underglazes and adding it for sun rays here, and you guys saw me use it in the hair as well. It was one of those sort of like slightly more opaque colors that I never would have used in the past, but I've been really playing with working with opaque watercolors and colors with more opacity at different stages in my work to see what the results would be. Once everything has had a chance to dry completely, utterly, and fully, it's time to do the satisfying tape peeling away at a 90-degree angle. This illustration had been sitting on a stretcher board for almost an entire year before I was able to get to it, so the paper really stuck to the tape. And honestly, Stonehenge Aqua always really sticks to the tape as well, so it's kind of a combo of the two. But that's okay. I don't really care about the edges of the illustration. I care about the illustration itself, which is why I will pull away at a 90-degree angle so it doesn't tear into the illustration. I'm going to use these Chinese watercolor weights just to kind of hold it down while I finish everything else. And here we have our finished Mother's Day Making Jam watercolor illustration with most, but probably not all, of the materials used to create it. This illustration took about 6 hours to paint, took about a week to paint, but that is not including the time I spent sketching it, the time I spent resketching it, or the time I spent inking it. So the number one takeaway I want you to leave with today is that art takes time, and be patient with yourself. You deserve to make art, and you deserve to give yourself the patience and the time you need to make the kind of art that you want to learn how to make. And hopefully today I've been part of your art and your watercolor journey. Hopefully I've encouraged you to make some art. If you're looking to get started with making art, I have a totally free mailing list where I share some of my best tips, tricks, suggestions, stories, and anecdotes to help inspire you on your artistic journey, whether you are just getting started or you've been making art for a while and you need some extra encouragement. And I will link that for you guys down in the description. This illustration is in my coloring book, Curious Little Things. It is a beautiful compendium of tiny life, and it was originally inspired by my other compendium of tiny life, Lilliputian Living. So if you like whimsical art, if you like heartwarming art, if you like families and friendships and plants and animals, you will like both of those, and I will have them linked for you guys down in the description below. I had so much fun painting this. I really love how this illustration turned out, and I hope I've inspired you guys today. Thank you so much for joining me. And speaking of thank you, a huge thank you to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Your support makes videos like this possible. So thank you, thank you, thank you.